Today's lesson, we're going to finish off chapter 11. We're going to finish off our study on hominins and how they coexisted, how they evolved, and how they interacted with each other by talking about how they moved around. Specifically, we're going to focus specifically on Homo sapiens, right? So far, we've looked at all the different hominins, which are the Australopithecus and also the Homo, all the species under the genus Homo. But today, we're going to focus specifically on Homo sapiens and see how they migrated out of Africa, or actually, there's going to be another part to it that I need to clearly mention so you guys have a clear understanding of it. But either way, we'll get to that. Today's lesson, we're going to basically focus on how we can use evidence such as fossils, DNA evidence, including whole genome analysis, nucleotide sequence analysis, and also mitochondrial DNA, which is specifically passed down on the maternal side, and how we can use all these different evidences to basically explain the migration of modern human populations out of uh, our point of origin. And that will also include talking about Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders populations and their connection to country and place. So we'll be looking at all the evidence to support our findings about how they moved from where we started, so where Homo sapiens evolved first, and how they migrated out from our point of origin to all the other places. So yeah, your glossary task. So essentially, what's important here to note first is that how are we deriving this information we're going to be looking at right now? How is it we got the evidence to talk about where they started off and how they evolved, how they evolved in the same place, and then how they migrated out of that place, and how is it we can actually trace it in a way that actually shows a pattern of migration, is by using two main sources of evidence. And in biology specifically, these are the two sources of evidence that we've been using even to derive information on evolutionary relationships. So it's going to be important for you guys to remember this. One is talking about fossil records, right? Basically, any evidence left behind by the organism itself, be that as a literal fossil of the organism or even trace fossils of the organism, which are uh, indications that that organism was existing there. We also use structural morphology of the fossil records to compare between the uh, different fossils that we find, to see how they have changed and what similarities that they have. When we have similarities, we can actually use that as an evidence of relatedness, in the sense that if they have homologous structures, we know that they are basically related to each other. And the more homologous structures they have, the more closely related they are as well, right? And basically, another way we can derive information about this is also by dating the fossils themselves and finding out how old they are. And this is actually a very useful technique, because by dating the fossils, be that either as a relative dating or absolute dating, we can get a sense of how old the fossil is. And as a sense, we can start to plot a timeline of when this fossil emerged here, when that fossil emerged there, and start to notice a pattern of migration. Typically, if we're looking at one species, talking about Homo sapiens, right? If we looked at all the patterns of fossils appearing for Homo sapiens and how it shows a pattern, we can actually start to lay out a migration pattern relating to Homo sapiens. Using these kind of homologous structures to also determine using these homologous structures as a evidence for relatedness is also a way to serve a physical evidence of divergent evolution. So in the sense that if we see different species have homologous structures, we can actually use that as a physical evidence of them having diverged at one point from each other, right? So if species A and species B have a lot of homologous structures, that means we can say that at one point they would have diverged from each other to become two different species, but it would have happened very recently versus very long ago if they had very little homologous structures. So it's basically a physical evidence of that kind of evolution. Another type of evidence that we use is molecular homology. This is basically using any information when it comes to DNA or amino acid sequencing or even nucleotide sequencing. And sorry, let me just restart. Molecular homology is using any form of DNA evidence, be that nucleotide sequencing, amino acid sequencing, or even mitochondrial DNA. So these are three different forms, three different sources of information, such that the nucleotide sequencing is just talking about your nuclear DNA, the DNA found in your nucleus, looking at how that changed and how many differences there are. Second one is amino acid sequence. For a specific protein, look at the amino acid sequence that's making it up, see which amino acids, how many amino acids are different between different species. That shows a comparative study of how related they are. And third is the mitochondrial DNA. Because mitochondrial DNA is preserved, is basically passed down from the maternal side only, and there's no mixing happening with your paternal side. Basically, there is no recombination of the DNA sequence happening. We can actually use mitochondrial DNA as a kind of evidence of inheritance and also looking at where where the source of that has come from. Because mitochondrial DNA, certain details about it make it very good as a comparative study. One is that we know it has a high rate of mutation. So if we find that there is a high amount of mutation happening in the mitochondrial DNA at a certain point in time, we can actually use that information to say that maybe they were there for a very long time. That's why they had a lot of mitochondrial DNA mutations accruing at that one point. So it's basically another source of information. So molecular homology is looking at using any information that comes from your DNA and any other form of proteins as well. And by combining our findings from both of these sources, we can get a more clearer picture of relatedness of species, but also their migration patterns. So let's think about how the tribe of hominins basically spread, talking about human migration in a bit, right? So first, let's look at the genus that you guys are aware of. One of the first genuses, sorry, one of the first genuses you're aware of under the tribe of hominin, which is your Australopithecines, right? These are one of the early genuses involved in your hominin tribe. And one thing we know about them is that they were not migrating out of Africa. They were basically staying within the African continent and were not migrating out at any point. Only when we came down to our genus of Homo, specifically our the species of Homo erectus, we detected evidence that showed that they migrated out of Africa to different regions of the Earth, specifically looking at China and Indonesia, because that's where we found fossils showing the species of Homo erectus. So that is basically an evidence showing that this was first species of our hominin tribe to have actually left the African continent about 2 to 2.25 million years ago. And we have a theory that they spread around Europe and Asia, as evidenced by the fossils that we found in China and Indonesia. We also later found evidence of other species of the tribe of Homo, the genus of Homo being, having migrated out of Africa, which is the finding of fossils. And some of the species that we can relate that back to is Homo neanderthals, Homo ergaster, Homo florensis, and Homo heidelbergensis, and also small different not as well documented species of Homo that we also talked about in the past. So we could find these fossils outside of Africa. So that is an indication that they at one point did migrate out of Africa along with the rest of the Homo erectus, going to different sections of the earth. So if you see these migratory patterns, you can see that they moved around a lot. They migrated into Europe, they migrated into Asia, they even came down here and eventually even went down to the Australian continent as well. So that is generally showing the migratory patterns of the genus Homo. And when we're talking about the genus Homo, that also includes the Homo sapiens. So concerning Homo sapiens, our migration patterns, there's basically two hypotheses that we are considering as being they're basically being considered when it comes to the migratory patterns for Homo sapiens. One is talking about a multi-regional hypothesis, and the other is talking about a out of Africa hypothesis. Both of these differ in their details, and they are both considered due to the fact that fossil records and other evidences can be uncertain at times. Remember that we talked about in our previous lesson, there is uncertainty present within our findings of fossils and also evidence. So sometimes we also have to consider other possibilities, and we also have to think about what is the evidence present before we can have a final theory that we are supporting, right? Remember it's in biology or remember in science that when we call something a theory, that is very well evidenced and very well supported. So we are not having any doubts about that. But when we're calling it a hypothesis, we are still trying to get more solid evidence to have a firmer foothold on that statement. Yes?
What are the two theories about?
So that's the thing. They're not theories. They are hypotheses, right? It's very important to make that distinction because when you use theory in biology or science, you're basically saying that is basically the most well supported. Not saying well supported. It's the general idea that everyone is accepting, right? Like theory of evolution, theory of natural selection. These are well evidenced, well supported, and all the evidence that we are gathering now is just supporting that. Whereas when we call something a hypothesis, we are basically still trying to find more evidence to have a clearer understanding of it. But in general, the out of Africa hypothesis is well evidenced. And if there was one that was chosen to be the most supported or the most valid at the current point, it would definitely be the out of Africa hypothesis. Whereas when we talk about the multi-regional hypothesis, we do have some ideas of why that could be a possible thing that could have happened. Basically, it is highlighted to show the uncertainty and complexities present in our understandings of human fossil records, right? Remember in our previous lesson, we talked about the human fossil record being uncertain sometimes due to gaps in our findings and due to fossils not being able, we are not able to find fossils as readily and easily for Homo sapiens and other species of Homo. So we have to sometimes consider other hypotheses to be able to have the best range of ideas that might be the truth, right? So, like I said, the prevailing understanding is that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 200,000 years ago before migrating to different parts of Eurasia. And that's why we call that the out of Africa hypothesis. Basically, that's saying that we evolved in Africa and then eventually only migrated out of Africa to go to the different regions, as you can see here. Whereas the multi-regional hypothesis, explaining that, let me just go to the next slide to explain that. Right, so this is talking about what is each hypothesis basically explaining. So the out of Africa hypothesis model that shows that Homo sapiens first developed and evolved in Africa and were there for a certain amount of time, and only after that did they expand into different regions of the earth, actually spreading out, migrating immigrating into different populations and eventually even replacing the earlier hominins that had spread there. So any Homo Neanderthals, any Homo Augustus, any other different homos all around the earth eventually got replaced by Homo sapiens after we migrated out of Africa. So that's the first one. The second one, the multi-regional hypothesis, is slightly more not complex, but it's far-fetched in the sense that it's saying that the Homo sapiens first didn't evolve in Africa. What happened is that when Homo erectus migrated out and all the different uh, tribe, all the different genuses, all the different species of the genus Homo spread out as well. What happened was there was gene flow and interbreeding happening between the different populations of the genus Homo, and eventually that gave rise to the species of Homo sapiens. So it's basically saying that separate human populations evolved independently from earlier hominins that had spread throughout Eurasia and experienced gene flow. So they're saying basically as a result of the different populations, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Homo florensis, Homo Neanderthals, all these different populations of the genus Homo, because there was gene flow and interbreeding between them, there was eventually the emergence of a new species known as Homo sapiens, and that happened multiple times in different regions around the earth. And that is what the multi-regional hypothesis is trying to suggest. So now we'll talk about what's the evidence behind it as well for the different hypotheses. And obviously, you'll see it later, but the evidence supporting the out of Africa hypothesis is much stronger and much more uh, clearly outlined compared to the other hypothesis. So basically, when it comes to the out of Africa hypothesis, it's talking about when Homo sapiens evolved in Africa about 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. That's our point of origin. And we stayed in Africa for about a few 100,000 years. Sorry, 100. The timeline is a bit strange, but a few tens of thousands of years. And then eventually we left Africa and started to migrate out of Africa into Europe and Asia. So, what is the evidence to support it? The first one is the first one is talking about mitochondrial DNA studies. If we actually trace back all modern humans' mitochondrial DNA like we could because of the low recombinance, we can actually start to trace it back. We see that there is a lineage that goes back to a common African ancestor somewhere around 150 to 300,000 years ago. So it's basically a line of inheritance that we can follow all the way back to a common African ancestor. That's the first one, mitochondrial DNA study. The second one is the genetic diversity that we can find when it comes to mitochondrial DNA as well. So first of all, modern DNA, modern humans all around the earth show very low genetic diversity when it comes to mitochondrial DNA. So in the sense of, remember how I said that mitochondrial DNA has a high rate of mutation? So that high rate of mutation can only happen if enough time has passed through, right? And to see that there's a low amount of genetic diversity with the population out of Africa, that means that not a lot of time has passed since people have moved out of Africa. Whereas when we study the mitochondrial DNA of people in Africa, we can see there's a higher amount of diversity, indicating that there was a long period where Homo sapiens evolved and stayed in Africa, accumulating that kind of mutations in their mitochondrial DNA, showing that there's a higher diversity of it, whereas people who migrated out of Africa are still not too long ago, so they still haven't accumulated that much of mutations in their mitochondrial DNA. Anyone doesn't understand this part? Okay. Moving on. Next is our fossil evidence, right? This basically showing a much more clearer uh, evidence of the migratory patterns of Homo sapiens, where we found one of the oldest Homo sapien fossils we found was actually in the coast of East Africa, and it was later found that more fossils were found in the Middle East and when we dated them, we found that the fossils found in the east coast of Africa was about 160,000 years ago, whereas the fossils we found in the Middle East were about 100,000 years ago. So, like I said, right, by using fossils and by dating them, we can actually show a pattern of how it might have moved, right? Because one fossil is older, so they were there longer in the past, and one is more recent, showing that eventually they would have moved into a different region. Yes.
Genetic diversity. My sister did she did a 1, 2, 3 of me test. It's like a genetic test, like they show you where you're from, and it's not just the end.
Sorry?
She said it said that she had part of her DNA. Like two, I think it was like 0 point something percent.
0 point something percent.
Yeah.
Interesting. What could have happened was that this is a very, I'm like putting out theory, and I don't know your family history, so this is purely out of theory. If and when Homo neanderthals did migrate out of Africa, it's not to say that none of them were remaining in Africa, right? There could have been a small remnant that was still there, or like they were basically still like in the population, gene flow was still happening. So even though we evidence gene flow as to have occurred in Europe for Homo neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that's what's supporting the fact that almost everyone in Europe and around the world have about 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA, except for a lot of Africans who don't. Maybe there was just enough that it could give a 0.2, or that's just a genetic abnormality in the sense that it's detecting something, even though when you think about it, genetics are your DNA is made up of 4 letters. So when it comes to combinations of letters like sequences, you can appear. It's not really that many. Sometimes a random sequence can appear out of just randomness that kind of relates or is similar to a different species. That's why even the percentage is what 0. Yeah, that could be a abnormality in the sense that it was just detected by the system, relating it back to the Homo neanderthal DNA. So when it comes to biology, there's a lot of ways you can consider it. Then you have to do your basically experiments to prove it wrong or right. That's why it's a whole complex process. But there is a lot of possible reasons why that could have been the case. So, okay.
Is that live?
It's when it comes to genetics and especially these DNA tests, something like 0.02, it's an abnormality more often than not, because like it's not even a significant amount to be even considered as being part of your DNA. If you say 1%, it's like, okay, maybe you can like start to theorize what could have happened. But 0.02%, that sounds very more like just the system was just trying to find what's the matching DNA sets, DNA copies. Possibly it found a copy that is not necessarily from a descendant rather than just random mutations popping it up. Okay, anyway, coming back to this. So that's the third evidence, right? The fossil evidence showing that there is basically a pattern of there's a timeline in which Homo sapien fossils were found and dated, where the oldest fossil was found in Africa, east coast of Africa, at the age of 160,000 years ago, 60,000 years, whereas the second fossil was found later in Middle East for about 100,000 years ago old, showing that there was a migration happening with Homo sapiens. Lastly, the third one is that we found cultural artifacts, right? Stone tools, carvings, cave paintings in various regions in Europe and Asia, and they were dated to about 80,000 year old tools, and also in the UAE it's about 74,000 year old tools, and in India it's about 40,000. Very backwards. 80,000-year-old tools in the UAE, 75,000-year-old tools in India, 40,000-year-old cave paintings in Europe. So there is a show that also indicates there was a timeline of people existing on these different regions, right? So that shows that maybe they migrated here as well. Also, one population migrated there into different regions as well. And this is evidenced by the artifacts that were left behind. So, along with fossil records and also DNA evidence, sometimes we also end up using cultural artifacts to indicate migratory patterns of one specific species, right? So, that's also a useful technique. So, we will use any kind of information that we can find to also study these kind of migratory patterns and also any relationships that they share. So now let's go into the multi-regional hypothesis of why this is still present, right? So what it's about and why it's still being postulated, and also why we don't really feel like this is uh, basically the primary hypothesis. So first of all, the multi-regional hypothesis posits that modern humans evolved from several geologically separate groups of Homo erectus across Africa and Eurasia when there was gene flow occurring with these populations. Thus, modern humans are not solely of African descent but originated from local populations of early hominins in different regions. So basically, like I said, right, when the first population of Homo erectus, these were the first species of Homo, the genus Homo, to migrate out of Africa, and eventually they settled into different regions as well. And what happened was that there was gene flow happening within the different populations, and over time there was an emergence of Homo sapiens as a result of different gene flow events and also interbreeding events. And why is it that we don't feel, I'll talk about why we think this might be true, is the reason for this postulation is that people say that specific to regional trait that there are morphological clades that are specific to regional traits, right? And this was uncovered in certain in fossils, such as in a Chinese region. There were fossils that were found that where the fossils basically had features like facial flatness and a non-depressed nasal root, specific to Homo sapiens, right? And this was thought to have indicated that maybe when Homo erectus migrated to the different regions, there was what's the word? Evolution that drove them to a specific morphological clade, and after that, gene flow and interbreeding emerged to bring those humans out as well, so bring out Homo sapiens as well. And as such, they said that rather than one central Homo sapien evolving in Africa and then eventually migrating to different regions, they would have happened in different geological areas, eventually emerging out of a population of Homo erectus. Why is it that we don't really support this, and we say that there are a few reasons against it even, is that first of all, there is incomplete fossil evidence to indicate this was the case. Basically, fossil record is too incomplete to try to support the existence of distinct morphological clades. So basically, even though there is this one fossil that we found, we haven't really found enough evidence of fossil records to support this idea. Another one is that many studies also don't use or don't include these kind of different fossil specimens to provide a reliable evidence. So even if we do find any fossils, we don't really include them in studies because they're not really valid to be included, or not really, just basically not just included, and they don't provide a reliable evidence supporting this hypothesis. All right, so essentially, two hypotheses exist. One is the out of Africa hypothesis, and the other one is the multi-regional hypothesis. The out of Africa hypothesis says that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, stayed in Africa for about 50,000 to 100,000 years, and then only migrated out to the different regions. And we have a bunch of different evidences, mitochondrial DNA studies, genetic diversity studies, fossil evidence, and also cultural artifacts to support this hypothesis. Whereas the other one, which is the multi-regional hypothesis, is saying that modern humans evolved from several geographically separate groups of Homo erectus across Africa and also Eurasia, where be that Europe, Asia, or Australasia, and saying that modern humans are basically originated from local population of early hominins that had gene flow and interbreeding among them, eventually giving rise to the Homo sapiens. And we don't have a lot of evidence. In fact, there are more reasons against this hypothesis than there are for, and that's why we use it as a way to postulate basically that there is still uncertainty and complexities present in our understanding of human fossil records. So that's why we still have to consider different ideas. Even though it's not well supported, it is still considered as an idea that we should keep in mind because there is still a lot of uncertainty and complexities present in our understanding of the human fossil record. So we need to still rule out more ideas than shoot them down. So beyond this, we're going to be talking about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's connection to country and place. We're basically going to talk about Aboriginal Australians and how their migratory patterns emerged specifically in the Australian continent. Yeah. Right. So essentially, let's relate it back to the first picture we saw about the migration pattern. So based on this picture, that there was Homo sapiens evolved in Africa first, then they spread out about 100,000 to 150,000 years ago, and then they emerged in different parts of the world, and we can trace these different times that we found based on the evidence that we found in these different places, right? 40,000 years ago, we can say that there was a presence of Homo sapiens in Europe because we found cave paintings to evidence that, and we also found fossils in the Middle East to prove that this was happening about 100,000 years ago, and so on in different regions. And when it comes to Africa, we found evidence to support that there was populations that were migrating into the Australian Australian continent. Actually, back then it's called Sahul. This is how Australia, not really Australia, but this region used to look like. So basically, Australia used to be a supercontinent where it had Papua New Guinea and also Tasmania connected in one main land. And what happened was basically rising sea levels caused the water to rise above those land crossings. Basically, this whole part got flooded, certain part of this got flooded. So Hobart, which is Tasmania, got separated from the mainland, and so did Papua New Guinea, got separated from the mainland. So we became three different islands rather than one huge supercontinent, right? So what happened is that, going back to how early Homo sapiens arrived in Sahul, about 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, we found evidence saying that there was a wave of migrants which reached the prehistoric continent called Sahul, right? And this population is your Aboriginal Australians. Aboriginal Australians are basically counted as one of the oldest surviving civilizations due to the fact that they basically became geographically isolated in one region right after they emerged, right after they migrated to that region, and after that they did not migrate anywhere else, and they were basically isolated from the rest of the world for the longest of time. So it is thought that basically a wave of migrants reached the prehistoric supercontinent called Sahul, and that is what we consider as the supercontinent is what consists of Papua New Guinea and also Tasmania, and this separation made the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, also known as the First Nation people, to become genetically and also geographically isolated, which is thought to have made them the world's oldest surviving civilization. Right. Any questions? So this is going to be kind of important. Sometimes you can ask questions relating to this. All right. Through the use, so basically, let's come back to the information part. Okay. So basically, by using fossil and DNA evidence, scientists have come to a working hypothesis for human migration out of Africa. According to this hypothesis, early humans migrated out of Africa after emerging in Africa for around 100,000 years, and then they basically migrated out, spreading in waves throughout much of Eurasia and replacing existing hominid populations that have lived in these areas prior. Basically, all the different all the different species of Homo that were also already migrated, starting from Homo erectus all the way to Homo neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo habilis, all these different populations that were already migrated, they eventually got replaced by Homo sapiens when they migrated out as well. And that there are fossil and DNA evidence to support that, right? Mitochondrial DNA evidence, also fossil evidence, and cultural evidence to also indicate that. So make sure you guys can reference these three evidence to show how the out of Africa hypothesis is well supported. And when we're thinking about modern Aboriginal Australians, we trace back their lineage back to their first migration out of Africa, which is believed around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. And when the first humans arrived on this land, and this essentially, irregardless, makes the Aboriginal Australians one of the oldest continuous populations on Earth, meaning that they have not become disrupted, they are basically isolated. And this is basically because Australia is surrounded by ocean, it's an island, it's basically an island. And as a result, it is also geographically isolated. And when some population has become geographically isolated, they are also genetically isolated. They're not getting a lot of gene flow happening from different populations. Whereas places like Europe, places like the Middle East and Asia, there was also still gene flow happening between different populations of Homo sapiens, whereas the population of Homo sapiens that arrived in Australia, the Aboriginal Australians, they became genetically and also geographically isolated from the rest of the Homo sapien population. That makes them basically the oldest continuous population on Earth. And that means the Aboriginal people have had a very strong connection to their country, to the country. And that means that, yeah, basically that's that. Any questions? So many things to remove. This is going to be a long edit. Okay, let's do questions, shall we?